Long Angela Merkel era has finally come to an end. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about something that I'm very interested in, which is time, and particularly in politics. I've always been fascinated by tenures of office. The length of time a leader is in power and the sort of chronology of that. I don't know. I've just always found that very interesting. Um, and with the departure of Angela Merkel, it seems like a good time to talk a little bit about it and to look at some of the data that's available on leaders. Firstly, a few words about Merkel because I was going to do this in a video anyway, but may as well do it here. 16 years is a long time, and a lot happened during her tenure, but nevertheless, there are some things that stand out particularly. I think the 2015 migrant crisis is something that certainly outsiders would certainly look at. I was in Dusseldorf that year just for a day trip, and there was cancellation on my train going back. I was staying with my father in Rotterdam at the time, and so I had to stay overnight basically in Dusseldorf train station. It was a long night, lots of replacements. It was long and not very pleasant because this was a cold November night. Anyway, had to change train something like six times to get in, just from one town to another. It was a long night, but I remember a police officer getting on to check basically that there weren't migrant stowaways. Um, I think Merkel wanted to portray that at the time as this great humanitarian gesture, but I think allowing up to 1 million people into a country en masse over a relatively short period of time in retrospect was very reckless. And I think the implications of this were seen with the Cologne New Year attacks when German women were attacked by migrant men. Now, of course, before anyone says, "Oh, that's tapping into far right thinking" or whatever, it's important to note that the men involved in that incident were not they weren't Syrians. They were said to be of North African heritage. But I think that kind of reiterated some anxieties that Germans had. Um, and I know that people have expressed in Germany frustrations about issues around integration and so on. Yet at the same time, many Germans were very opening and welcoming of particularly Syrian refugees who had fled a war zone. But I think that is going to be seen as one of her major legacies, and not necessarily for all the right reasons. I mean, was it altruistic? Was it humane? Or was it just reckless? Was it grandstanding? I think that's going to be the big question. There were other issues too, the Greek debt crisis, how Merkel handled the Eurozone crisis, her foreign policy. Um, the thing about Angela Merkel, she was quite dull. She was never a very colourful character, but I think Germans liked that. I think she was seen as a stabilising force, and I think probably her chancellorship would be held in a fairly high regard. But one also gets the impression it was quite long and stagnated, and not necessarily. She didn't really come up with any revolutionary ideals or anything like that. I think if one word could be attached to Merkel aside from that migrant policy, it was stability. Just, I think her major achievement was probably longevity, political longevity, because in a democracy, it's very hard for a leader to last longer than a decade. Very hard, because you need to win elections. You need to be accountable to the people. In dictatorships, obviously, it's different. You just have president for life and, severe vote rigging and intimidation of opponents and so on. No free media. In a democracy, leaders are under a lot more pressure and scrutiny, and rightly so. Um, so I think for any leader to last a long time is an achievement in and of itself. Even though Merkel had no major, signature policy, the fact that she just survived that long is something. I feel she was not tough enough with China, and Russia a bit more so, but not with China. Merkel spoke out in human rights to her credit, but I think she should have taken a harder line with the Chinese, particularly over the last year. Um, when the Five Eyes made sort of joint declarations, and we invited our Western European allies to join in. There was hesitancy from Germany and Italy at the G7 summit earlier this year in Cornwall, for example. So I don't think Merkel's been as robust as she could have been in foreign policy. Having said that, I think it would be unfair to call her a puppet of Moscow. She has been outspoken on Putin's behavior. Um, and ultimately, she's running Europe's biggest economy, the world's fourth biggest economy. Germany's a major power. It'll be interesting to see what direction Olaf Scholz takes. I really don't know much about him. He's 63, he's SPD, he's centre-left politician, quite dull. Um, but I think Germans like that. I mean, Helmut Kohl was seen as a bit of a buffoon, but he lasted 16 years in office. So, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. When I say he was seen as a bit of a buffoon, I don't mean he was intellectually not intelligent, but his mannerisms were a bit flippant and a little bit like Boris Johnson almost. If I can make that analogy, just a bit flippant about things. And he famously had a tense relationship with Margaret Thatcher. Um, Gerhard Schroeder, far too cozy with Russia. I started getting into politics in the Schroeder era, and yeah, my looking back at Schroeder, I think he was far too cozy with Russia. Still is. Um, but Merkel will probably be seen as a stabilizing chancellor. But for many young Germans, they might ask justifiably, well, what's a big vision for the future? What's her major legacy? And I think it's quite hard to pin Merkel down in that sense. Certainly for Brexiteers in this country, they see her as one of the figureheads of that European project, that federalist Euro state. So some would say she, in that sense, was anti-democracy. Um, I don't know. I think certainly, along with successive French presidents, she's been the face of the EU. So I can certainly understand Eurosceptics not looking favorably on Angela Merkel. Anyway, Olaf Scholz certainly has his work cut out. Apparently, he's going to take a hard line on this new variant of COVID. Like the issues in the UK, I don't know how that's going to go down in Germany. Apparently, he's proposing very strict measures on COVID vaccines and mask wearing. I think Germans are quite. I don't think you see the same level of unrest that you would in Belgium or Italy or Greece or the UK. But people are people, and at some point, if these restrictions have no end in sight, I think people will they will naturally start to get frustrated. So I think that might be Schultz's first major test. If Putin invades Ukraine again, that's going to be another major test. So, tough talking is one thing, but Schultz needs to show that he's a strong Western leader. I mean, this guy came from quite a hard left background. He's centre left now. Um, so it'll be interesting to see. Will he be a friend of the Atlanticist platform, or will he be a sort of Europhile alternative? I mean, I think it's on our interest to have close working ties with major Western powers like Germany, like France, for trade, for diplomacy, because we live in a very uncertain world. And I think that, you know, um, the fallout from Brexit, leaders shouldn't be pedantic about that. They shouldn't be vindictive towards the British for that. Um, and I just hope that Berlin takes a leadership role when it comes to the likes of Russia and China, because we need strong Western powers. Britain and America and Canada and Australia, New Zealand recently has been uncertain. But alone, I think we need to really have an alliance of democracies, including Japan and South Korea. That's my gut feeling. Okay, so to get to the what I was going to do in this video, just thinking about longevity of democratic leaders, Merkel actually ranks as the longest serving woman leader in the Western world ever, um, outside of Queens, obviously. 16 years and 16 days. It's a very long time. Um, Helmut Kohl was slightly longer, 16 years and 26 days, literally 10 days longer than Merkel. Um, So it's interesting she didn't want to hang on just a little bit longer just to surpass Kohl's record. I know Theresa May did solely to surpass Gordon Brown's record, although it wasn't particularly long. But for me, I remember visiting Berlin with my father on my 20th birthday in 2005, and the federal election was going on, and that's how long Merkel's been in power. The entire 2010s decade, half of the 2000s, and well into the 20s. So it's a very long time in democratic politics. Many Germans will have grown up knowing nothing but Merkel. It's still a little bit hard to believe that she's actually now ex-Chancellor Merkel. We have current Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So if we look at like the longest serving Western leaders, Helmut Kohl is at the top, then Merkel. Next up, I think must be Francois Mitterrand. I've just been looking at the data from major Western powers. Mitterrand was some 14 years in power, a long time. I'm talking about the modern era, say within my lifetime. Konrad Adenauer in Germany was also quite a long time, I believe, 14 years. But in the modern era, Francois Mitterrand, 14 years. Next is probably Jacques Chirac, 1995 to 2007 in France, some 12 years. And then it's Margaret Thatcher, 11 years, which seemed like an eternity in this country. And of course, Thatcherism had an impact much longer. So it shows how long Merkel has been in power when you consider that Thatcher and May's premierships put together is still a shorter time than the length of time that Angela Merkel was in power. Um, then after Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair and Canada's John Creechan, both 10 years in office. A decade is a long time in politics. Um, in Australia, John Howard was also 11 years. I think he had a record for an Australian Prime Minister. And if we look at Italy and Japan, Silvio Berlusconi and Shinzo Abe, both about 7 years, I believe. And if you look at Japanese and Italian politics, they change prime ministers pretty much every year. So 7 years in Italian or Japanese politics is a long time. Um, so yeah, it's just interesting to look at. I think many Germans will take a while to adapt to Schultz, and I think that's why both he and his rival during the campaign, Armin Laschet, were sort of emulating Merkel. But obviously, it's for Germans to decide whether he'll be a good chancellor or not. But I just hope he is a friend of the West, in the sense that because German chancellors, although it's a Western country, haven't always been pro-Atlanticist in the sense of taking a firm line with Moscow and Beijing. And I really think that if Schultz wants the EU to have some weight in the world, he needs to show that he will be outspoken on human rights and he will take a hard line with Russia and China. I understand that Russia, there's gas links, it's more complicated, but China, um, really, Germany needs to take a hard line there because it's Europe's most populous country. They need to send out a message. That's how I feel about it. So time will tell what the Schultz era will look like. Uh, if I've overlooked anyone, by the way, if there's any other leaders in Western countries that I've overlooked, do mention it in the comment section. I'm thinking about major powers, so there's probably some smaller countries which have had leaders for a long, long time. But I'm thinking of the major powers. Um, American presidents, of course, are limited to 8 years in power, so I haven't mentioned them. Let me know your thoughts. If you're German, especially, what do you think of Angela Merkel? What do you feel her legacy has been? Do you think she's overrated? Um, what do you feel about Mr. Schultz? Do you think he will be a good chancellor? Time will tell.